The first sign was the blood in the snow, not the bright, fresh kind that steams and drips and cries out for help, but the old kind, dark, frozen into a crust, smeared into the powder with the lazy drag of something heavy being pulled by one arm. It crossed the trail a few hundred paces above the timberline, right where the stone slabs broke up the snow into jagged ridges, and the sky always seemed more brittle. Esther Lawton saw it before her mules did, but just barely. She yanked the lead line and clicked her tongue, pressing her shoulder into the wind. The animals hesitated, stamping nervously, their breath rising in quick, cloudy huffs. Below them, the entire valley of Ridge Run fell away in layers of ghost-white drifts, black pines, and curling smoke from cabins 1,000 feet below. She didn't look back. She never did. Let them mock her all they wanted. The blood trail curved uphill toward a narrow slit between two boulders, a hidden draw she'd found scouting alone that first terrible summer after Isaac died. The place no one else would have dared build. Too exposed, too isolated, too stupid, they said. But she'd done it anyway. And now, as the wind whistled sharp across the rock, the air dry as bone, she followed the drag trail with her rifle unbuckled and her coat cinched tight at the throat. The old leather creaked with frost. Her knees ached from the climb. The sun was just beginning to fall behind the opposite ridge, throwing the sky into that familiar blue-gray hush that meant only one thing up here: storm. She knew what that meant. She only had a few hours. And if what she found at the top of that trail was what she feared, then she'd have more than the storm to deal with. The first time they saw her dragging cedar logs up that slope like some kind of mountain ghost, the settlers down in Ridge Run had laughed. A widow, alone, no sons, no hired help, building a cabin not near the creek, not even down by the pass trail, but on the wind-whipped granite peak above the ridge, where the clouds kissed the stones and nothing grew but moss and wind. "Madness," old Bo Catterson had muttered, his tobacco leaking from the corners of his mouth as he leaned over the trading post porch rail. "She'll freeze to death 'fore the shingles rot. Can't plant nothing up there," someone else added. "She got no man, no family. What's she running from?" No one ever asked her to her face. That was 2 years ago, and she didn't forget a single word. She'd buried Isaac herself, dug the hole in frozen ground after the fever took him quick. There was no one else left by then. Not after the baby, not after the second one. Just her, a horse that died the next spring, and 2 mules so stubborn they bit each other raw during the thaw. That summer she scouted high. She didn't want to see the valley anymore, didn't want to pass the graves each morning, didn't want to be close enough for the neighbors to look at her with those tired, pitying eyes that meant they thought she'd follow Isaac soon, just slower. So she picked the peak, she picked the wind, she picked the cold, and then she made it hers. Now, 2 winters later, her cabin was the only thing standing above the fog line, built tight into a rock shelf, with its back to the mountain and its face turned south, just enough sun to keep the snow from caking the shutters. A chimney made of salvaged stone, a hearth buried 2 feet into the floor, and a roof so low it caught the heat and held it like a trap. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't wide, but it was warm, and more than once it had saved her. But this winter wasn't like the others, not with that trail of blood, not with the wolves getting bolder, and not with the storm coming down harder than she'd ever seen it. She found the boy just past the draw, face down, no shoes. His feet were black with frostbite, cracked and stiff as antlers. One hand was curled around his waist, the other gone, bitten clean off. His side was torn where the ribs poked through, and from the way the trail dragged, it was clear he'd kept crawling even after the arm went. Behind him, the tracks were messier. Not wolves, not at first. Boot prints, 2 sets, full grown. Then the scuffle, then the drag, then the trail. She scanned the snow line with narrowed eyes. The wind blew hard enough to lift her hood. Her hand tightened on the rifle. There wasn't time to dig a grave, not if she wanted to make it home before the storm wall dropped. But she couldn't leave him, not like this. She took her knife, cut the rope from her mule's pack, and wrapped the boy's body tight in canvas. His face, what was left of it, was turned toward the valley. She paused, glanced that way once, then hoisted him across the saddle, and just before she mounted, she saw it. Far below, in the mouth of the forest, where the draw opened onto the southern slope, 2 men, half hidden by pines, watching. She didn't wait, she rode. It was pitch black by the time she reached the peak. The wind howled across the ridge like a living thing, hissing between the stones, slamming against the shutters. Her hands were bleeding from the climb. The mules had nearly tipped on the ice shelf 3 times, but she made it. She kicked the snow from her boots, dragged the body inside, and bolted the door behind her. Inside, the cabin was just big enough for a hearth, a cot, a table, and a second cot she'd never used. It had been meant for Isaac. She'd never brought herself to break it down. Now, she laid the boy there. She'd heat water, clean him, pray, and then, If those men followed, she'd be ready. The storm hit with a violence that shook the mountains. Down in the valley, the wind bent trees sideways. Shingles peeled like bark. Smoke vanished mid-air. And in the dark, settlers huddled in drafty cabins with fireplaces that couldn't draw, walls that leaked snow, and roofs that sagged under every gust. But up on the peak, above the tree line, above the fear, the widow's cabin held, and inside, lit by one flickering lantern, she sat sharpening her axe with the boy's knife, her rifle loaded, and leaned against the window, waiting for footsteps she already knew were coming. Because the storm wasn't the only thing hunting that night, and whatever those men had done, they weren't finished. The blizzard raged like a beast unchained. Winds screamed across the summit, battering the peak with such fury that snow swirled horizontal, a white wall slamming over the ridge, burying trail and stone alike under a weight that no man could walk through. Below, Ridge Run vanished. The black pines blurred to ghosts. Cabins disappeared into the swirl, and through it all, the widow's cabin held. Inside, the timbers creaked like a ship at sea. The shutters groaned against their iron latches. But the rock foundation, buried into the shelf, wrapped in dirt and sealed with clay, never flinched. The hearth glowed steady. Warmth clung low to the floor. A thin curl of smoke trickled from the buried chimney pipe at the back, but vanished in the gale before it could be seen. Esther sat still on the floorboards, her back against the cot, her rifle across her lap, the axe resting on the table beside a bowl of half-melted snow. The boy's body was wrapped tight in canvas again, dry now, and she'd rebound the stump of his arm, though there was no longer any blood left to stop. She hadn't spoken, she hadn't wept, she'd just listened. Because through the storm, beyond the groan of wood and the roar of wind, came another sound, scraping, boots on stone. They were coming, and she knew why. The night after she buried Isaac, a man had come to the door. Not a neighbor, not from Ridge Run, a stranger, tall, grey around the edges, polite with words that didn't match the look in his eyes. He'd said he was just passing through, said he needed shelter, said he could pay. Esther had looked down at her shotgun, then up at him, then said nothing. Just shut the door, latched it. Next morning, she found her saddlebags rifled and one chicken missing from the coop. His prints were long gone, but the message was clear. There are men who wait for grief to loosen the world around a woman. She had no intention of letting that happen again. So when she built the cabin up on the peak, she carved the steps with hands that didn't shake. She built the latch with a stone deadbolt and reinforced the door with spikes. She set bear traps behind the woodpile, beneath loose snow, where no man would step if they were welcome. She didn't leave a path to the outhouse, just walked a different way each time. She dug a cellar and laid her food with care, and when she chopped firewood, she did it on the far side so the echo would confuse the distance. And still they watched, still they whispered, still they waited. The sound came again, scraping at the side wall now. She stood slowly, no panic, no breath wasted. She moved like a woman who had counted these moments before they arrived. The lamp was already doused, her boots still on, the coat hung nearby. She slipped it on with one hand while the other lifted the rifle, careful not to let the barrel tap the window. The wind masked all else now, but between the gusts, she swore she heard whispering, not loud, close, like someone trying not to wake a dog. She moved to the door, silent. Her eyes flicked once to the cot. The boy hadn't moved, not even a twitch. She opened the floor panel at the hearth's edge, a small hatch she'd cut herself into the cellar when she built it, and reached inside, retrieving a second bundle wrapped in oilskin, a revolver half-loaded, a skinning knife, and a pouch of bear-shot shells for the rifle. Then she did something she hadn't done in months. She whispered, not a prayer, just one word, now, and stepped outside. The wind tore at her instantly, slapping her coat wide. She pushed into it, hugging the stone wall, crouching beneath the cabin eaves. Snow swirled so hard she could only see 10 paces, but the shape she saw moving near the outhouse wasn't a deer. It stood too tall. It didn't flinch in the wind, and it was circling. She dropped flat into the drift, rifle forward, watching. The figure stepped sideways, slow, deliberate. A pause. Then a second figure appeared behind it. Both moved with the cautious steps of men who'd climbed this way before. Her guts twisted. This wasn't random. They knew her, or knew enough. They weren't stumbling blind through the storm. They were probing, watching, measuring the time between patrols, and they thought she was alone. She fired first. The blast cracked so loud it punched through the wind like a bell, echoing down the valley. One figure dropped instantly. The other bolted sideways toward the tree line, but the snow was too deep. She swung the rifle, took aim, fired again. The blast hit wide, but it was enough to send the man diving for cover behind the outhouse. And now she had him pinned. She chambered another shell. Then the cabin door exploded open behind her. They'd sent 3, The third man had gone around the other side, circling low along the slope, past the stone overhang where the snowdrifts piled too deep for sight. He'd crept up during the gunfire, waited for the sound, then kicked the door in. But what he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the floorboards inside had a second hatch, and Esther had left it open. The trap sprang as he stepped inside. She'd rigged it long ago, a loose beam beneath the cot that dropped a crate of firewood when kicked. The moment he passed the threshold, the weight dropped, knocking his feet sideways. He crashed hard, shoulder first into the cot post. Then the boy moved. He wasn't dead, not yet, and his one good hand swung something heavy. The cast-iron kettle from the hearth. It caught the man in the side of the head. He reeled. Then Esther was through the door, rifle leveled. He never got up again. She bolted the door, set the crate against it, turned. The boy lay half-slung off the cot, breathing shallow. His lips were cracked, eyes glassy. She dropped beside him, heart pounding from cold and adrenaline. "You stayed quiet," she whispered. He tried to smile, failed. She took his hand. "You hit him." He blinked once, then twice. She didn't ask more. She pulled him upright, set the kettle aside, and went to tend the fire. The wind howled louder, and the storm kept falling. But they weren't alone now, not anymore. At dawn, the snow had buried the tracks. The second man was gone, either dead in the drift or crawled back downhill like a snake with its tail cut. She didn't go looking. She dug a trench outside and buried the first man where the woodpile used to be. His face hadn't frozen kind. She didn't care. She said no words, marked nothing. The boy watched from the window. When she came in, she fed him boiled roots and dried venison. "You got a name?" she asked. He nodded faintly. "Eli," he croaked. "Eli Mather." She froze at that. "Mather?" He blinked. "I was with my pa." She stood slowly. "Your pa," she said, quiet now, "wouldn't be Ezekiel Mather, would he?" Eli looked down. "Yes'm." That name hadn't been spoken in Ridge Run for a long time. Not since the avalanche. Not since the logging camp buried 20 men when the snowslide hit early. Not since the rumors started that Mather had been the one who'd fired the blast charge too soon, that he'd cut corners, taken bribes, let the men go in early. They'd never found the bodies, only the camp tools and the debts. He'd vanished that winter. Everyone thought he'd gone east. Now Esther knew better, and she knew why they'd hunted the boy. It wasn't about wolves. It wasn't random. It was revenge. The wind died 2 days later. Not completely. It never did up here, but it eased enough that the shutters stopped rattling like gunfire, and the drifts stopped slamming sideways across the chimney. Morning came slow, quiet. A pale grey light crept through the slit in the shutters, weak but clear, casting a thin, silvery band across the cabin floor. Esther didn't move right away. She sat by the hearth, legs folded beneath her, boots still laced tight. The fire had burned low but steady, the coals red beneath the ash, warm enough to keep frost from the walls. She'd stoked it every few hours through the night, rising in silence, watching Eli sleep. His fever had broken sometime before dawn. She'd felt his skin, rough and hot before, now cold but calm. The blackness in his feet hadn't spread further. She'd lanced 2 blisters, cleaned the wounds with snow and spruce bark tea, and poured her only measure of whiskey down the ragged bite in his ribs. He hadn't screamed, not once, and now he slept like the dead. She finally stood, stretched her back, and stepped outside. What she saw stopped her breath. The valley was gone, not in distance, not in fog, but gone the way a town is gone after fire. Below the peak, where the slope curved east into Ridge Run's outer hills, a path of destruction carved itself like a black wound in the white, a ragged gash of downed trees, twisted rooftops, and scattered debris, all buried halfway in broken drifts. The lower cabins were dark, chimneys gone, smoke absent. The little trail that once wound through the pass toward the trader's post had vanished under a shelf of snow so thick it had cracked the pine trunks like toothpicks. The avalanche had hit hard, and it hadn't come from above. It had come from the eastern bluff, a place that never should have broken unless someone had helped it. Her stomach sank. She stared longer, scanning for movement. Nothing. No horses, no flags, no searchers. Only one thing stirred, a trail of smoke, faint and distant, curling from the far side of the valley, near the ridge where the old logging camp once stood. She knew it then. They were back. Whoever had hunted the boy hadn't been alone, and if they'd come this far, they'd come farther, which meant Ridge Run wasn't just buried. It had been buried on purpose. She went back inside and sealed the door. Eli was stirring now, face pale, eyes barely open. She crouched beside the cot, dipped her hand into the pot of melted snow, and wrung the cloth out across his lips. He drank slowly. "You're staying awake this time," she muttered. "You hear?" He blinked. You said your pa was Ezekiel Mather. Where was he taking you? The boy swallowed. Said we had to go east. Why? His voice cracked. He stole something from the men he used to work with. I didn't know. He told me when they caught us. Esther's jaw tensed. Caught you where? Near the low trail, 2 days ago. She nodded slowly. That's where I found you. You were alone. He looked away. He gave himself up, told me to run. A pause. They didn't want him. Esther didn't speak. She just let the quiet settle. Then she stood, crossed to the cupboard, and unwrapped a bundle of dried meat. She tossed a sliver into a pot, added snow, and set it over the fire. The boy would need strength, because if the smoke was what she thought, the men were setting up camp, and she'd learned one thing living up here. When a man builds where no one dares tread, he means to stay. By midday, the storm had fully passed. The sky cleared sharp and blue above the ridgeline. Shadows lengthened early, the kind of light that makes everything colder, not warmer. The wind softened to a low hiss through the rock, and the trail she'd carved herself down to the stone shelf below the cabin was visible again in patches where the snow hadn't drifted. She stood with her rifle slung, the skinning knife at her belt, and a satchel half-packed with jerky sulfur matches and a single oil lantern. Not enough for a long run, but enough to scout. Eli stirred behind her, watching from the cot. I'm coming back, she said without turning. You'll be fine here. Fires stacked for a day, doors barred, traps set. He said nothing, but she knew what he was thinking. What if they find you? He finally asked. She paused, then looked at him over her shoulder. They already did. The descent took most of the afternoon. She traveled light and fast, skirting the trail she knew too well. The snow had hardened under the night's freeze, letting her tread fast where the slope allowed. But the stretch between the draw and the stone cut was a mess of broken pine and ice-glazed rock. She moved with the silence of a ghost, not for fear, but because habit shaped her now. There had been too many nights when a wrong step meant a twisted ankle and no rescue. She'd taught herself to walk like a cat on granite, even in boots, even in snow. By dusk, she reached the overlook, a shallow bend in the ridge where a flat stone shelf looked out toward the eastern valley and the old remains of the logging camp. She crouched behind a fir stump and lifted the spyglass. What she saw confirmed everything. 3 canvas tents, a line of horses, a fire ring dug into the snow with stones around it, men in coats, not settlers' coats, but heavier, darker, more uniform, boots that matched, packs laid evenly, not the look of wanderers, the look of planners. She counted 4, maybe 5, and beside one of the tents, a wagon, partially tarped, but not well. Inside, under the flap, something gleamed. She adjusted the glass. Metal, lots of it, brass. Hinges, cogs. She didn't know what it was, but she knew what it wasn't. Lumber. No lumberjack brought polished gears into the mountains. No logger wore black coats and hauled boxes up a buried trail. And no settler set up camp in avalanche country, right after a storm, unless they'd caused it, which meant Ridge Run hadn't been the target. It had been the cover. Whatever was in that wagon was what they came for. And now they had it, and were waiting. For who? She didn't know, but she was going to find out. She returned to the cabin under full dark. The stars blinked clear and cold. The moon cut a silver path through the snowdrifts. Her boots crunched once on the stone near the door, and then she froze. The trap was sprung, not tripped, not shattered, disarmed. The chain had been unlatched, coiled back neatly, and the jaw set open as if nothing had been there. She unslung her rifle, stepped sideways, and approached from the rear. No prints, no signs, just the faintest indentation near the window. And on the windowsill, a coin, shined, heavy, foreign. She picked it up. The face bore no country mark, no number, just a design, a crossed compass and square over a sunburst. She'd seen that once, years ago, when Isaac was still alive. A traveler had come through Ridge Run, claiming to be a mapmaker. Carried coins like this, said he was part of a fraternal guild, never explained more. Left in the night, the town forgot. Esther hadn't. She opened the door slow. Inside, Eli was sitting upright, eyes wide. You said you'd be back before dark, he whispered. I am. She stepped in, shut the door, and bolted it tight, then held up the coin. He went pale. I've seen that before, he said quietly. She nodded. Where? My pa? He had one, always kept it on a chain. Did they take it? I think that's why they wanted him. Esther stared at the coin. Whatever this was, it ran deeper than she'd thought. No longer just revenge. Now it was secrets, machines, and men who killed towns to protect them. She dropped the coin into her pocket and turned toward the cellar door. She had one more thing to do tonight. Something she hadn't done in over a year. Something she swore she'd never do again. She opened the trapdoor and pulled out the buried crate. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with rope, was Isaac's ledger, half map, half journal. The one he'd told her to destroy, she'd buried it instead. And now, as she laid it across the table, she saw the first line again. "If they ever come to the valley, don't fight them, run." She looked at Eli, looked at the fire, looked at the storm now past, and whispered, "No." The night didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a warning. Esther sat by the table, the ledger spread open, the fire casting flickers of gold across Isaac's penciled maps. Her hand moved slowly down the page, tracing the faded ink, a blend of terrain notes, ciphered entries, and strange coded drawings that had never made sense to her until now. Eli slept again, this time with less pain in his breathing. She'd soaked his feet in warm ash water, dressed the burns with spruce resin and rabbit fat. His color was better, his hands steadier, but his eyes, when they opened, always found the ledger. He knew it somehow, not every word, but what it meant, and that terrified her. Isaac had worked as a surveyor before the valley was even called Ridge Run, before the settlers came, before the fur trappers vanished and the passes were marked with bone and timber. She remembered the way he'd come home some nights, hands shaking, eyes red from staring at charts. He'd once told her, "There's things buried in this rock no one once found." She thought he meant fossils, but now she knew better, and as the fire cracked, and the storm winds finally settled into silence, she saw what she hadn't seen before. Isaac hadn't built the cabin on the mountain peak just for the sun. He'd built it to watch something. At dawn, Esther took the long path north. She left Eli with 3 loaded rounds, a full pot of water, and her father's knife tucked beneath his blanket. He didn't argue, just looked at her with that strange, half-knowing stare again, and nodded once. "Don't wait up," she said softly, then disappeared into the snow. The trail she took wasn't one anyone used. Not anymore. It curled along the upper bluff behind the peak, carved into rock she'd chipped herself with pick and blade. It rose, not fell, crossed, not through pines, but between stone stacks so narrow she had to turn sideways. No animals passed here, no settlers even knew it led anywhere, but it did. Isaac had shown her once, one time, and then never again. It took her an hour to reach the ridge, 2 more to climb the far shelf, and by the time the sun hit noon, she stood above the tree line, staring down into the other side of the valley, the hidden side, and there it was, buried, half-rotted, half-forgotten, the second cabin, Isaac's original build, the one she'd thought burned down, the one he told her to forget. She descended slow and broke through the frozen doorway with the flat of her axe. Inside, it smelled of rust and pine mold. The ceiling sagged, the far wall had collapsed where snowmelt had eaten through the frame, but the stone hearth still stood, so did the back shelf, and in that shelf, behind a panel she'd only seen once, was the lockbox. Heavy, brass, cold. She opened it. Inside were 3 things: a folded blueprint, a copper token with the same compass and sunburst symbol as the coin, and a sealed letter addressed to her, dated 3 years before Isaac's death. She sat in the frozen dust, opened the letter, and read, "Esther, if you're reading this, then they've come back. I never told you everything. I thought I could keep it away. I was wrong. What's buried here isn't gold. It isn't timber. It's older. Older than maps. Older than the war. Before Ridge Run, before the settlers, before they even called this the frontier, there were men who came here with machines. Strange ones. Big, loud. They dug under the rock, then vanished. Left something behind. I found one of their vaults by accident. I wasn't supposed to, but I did, and I marked it. That's what the ledger is. If you're still in the peak cabin, then it means you're close. But if they're looking for it, don't fight them. Get the ledger to someone who can end it. And for God's sake, don't let the boy fall into their hands. They know who he is. They know what's in his blood." Esther folded the letter with shaking hands. Her fingers went numb before her thoughts did. Machines, vaults, a boy. It all blurred together. Eli's father running, the gear-filled wagon, the coin on her windowsill, the avalanche timed too perfectly. None of it had ever been random. None of it was just old debts. They'd come for something buried, and for someone alive. The boy. Why? She stood slowly, took the blueprint, took the token, left the letter behind, and burned the cabin to the ground. The smoke rose fast, sharp, acrid. It curled black into the sky, visible from both sides of the mountain. She didn't care. Let them know she'd found it. Let them come looking. She had what she needed. By nightfall, she was back at the cabin. Eli was waiting at the door, pale, standing with one hand on the latch. "You saw it?" he asked. "I saw it. You burned it?" "Yes," he nodded. "Just once." "Good." She stepped past him, shut the door and placed the blueprint on the table. It showed the valley from an angle no settler would ever draw. From beneath, a map of tunnels, shafts, a spiral chamber cut into the mountainside. At the center was a mark, not a word, just a symbol, the same compass and sunburst again, and beside it, in Isaac's hand, 3 words. Key stored, Eli. Her throat went dry. She turned. "Tell me the truth," she whispered. "Who are you?" The boy didn't answer at first. Then he limped forward, hand on the table, and whispered, "My father wasn't just a thief. He used to work for them, the ones who built the machines, the ones who mapped the vaults, before he ran. And you? I was born in the valley, near the East Ridge, but not in a town." He lifted his shirt. A scar ran across his ribs, not from a knife, but from something surgical. "They put something inside me," he said. "Before I turned 5, Esther stared at him in horror. "Why?" His eyes gleamed in the firelight. "Because I was the only one who could open it." That night, Esther didn't sleep. She couldn't. Not with the blueprint staring at her. Not with Eli's words in her ears. Not with the wind rising again. This time from the south. They were coming. She didn't know how many, or when, or from which side. But they knew she had the ledger now, and they'd burned a town to get to the boy. They wouldn't hesitate again. She packed at dawn. Jerky, flint, bear shot. She loaded both rifles, strapped Eli's boots tighter with leather cord, and wrapped his legs in rabbit fur. "We're not running," she said as she latched the satchel. "Then where?" She looked at the peak through the window. "The vault, before they reach it. We collapse the entrance." Eli stared. "How?" She looked at him. "Isaac's journal had a powder recipe. I have half the ingredients." He blinked. "That's insane," she smirked. "They laughed when I built this place too." Outside, the first hawk call rang low and strange across the snow. A signal. They were closer than she'd guessed. She threw open the floor hatch, pulled out the blasting caps Isaac had hidden, old, oiled, still viable, and began stuffing the satchel. Eli reached for his coat, but she stopped him. "If they find us first," she said quietly, "you run, you find the pass, you bury the ledger again." He nodded, and for the first time, he smiled. The storm was gone. But the mountain was about to roar. The trail to the vault wasn't marked on any settler map. It cut straight beneath the peak's south face, veering off the known goat paths and plunging into the narrow stone gorge Esther and Isaac had once called the Knife Trail. At its narrowest, a man couldn't ride, only crawl, and in winter, the snow packed in hard enough to muffle even gunshots. That was why they'd picked it. That was why no one else had ever dared build there. It wasn't safe, and now, it was the only thing that might save them. Esther led the way, rifle slung, satchel heavy on her shoulder, breath hard in the cold. Eli limped behind her, wrapped in furs and grit, legs stiff but moving. He never asked how much farther. He didn't complain. Whatever was buried at the end of that trail, he felt it before they reached it. The boy didn't just carry the key. He was the key, and the mountain knew. They reached the entrance just before noon. It didn't look like much. Just a stone outcropping tucked into the lee of a high ridge, half covered in snow and overgrown roots. You could pass it 100 times and never see it, unless you knew the angles, unless you'd seen the lines in Isaac's blueprint. Esther cleared the snow with her boot. There it was, a flat metal slab, embedded into the rock. No handle, no hinges, just a single indentation the size of a palm, surrounded by the same compass and sunburst emblem. Eli stepped forward. He didn't hesitate. He placed his hand on the slab, and the mountain moved. It wasn't an explosion. It was quieter than that. A low, ancient grind, like stone being persuaded to part after centuries of stillness. The slab shivered, then slid inward, revealing a slope, not natural but carved, smooth walls, reinforced timber, ancient bolts in a language Esther didn't recognize, and cold, so cold it steamed in the mountain air. The boy stared down into the darkness, then looked back at her. "You don't have to come," she answered by drawing her second pistol and stepping inside. "I'm not letting them finish what they started." Inside, the tunnel curved fast, steep, the ceiling low. Frost clung to the walls, but the deeper they went, the warmer it became. The air changed, thickened. The silence became dense, like standing underwater. Then the chamber opened, and Esther stopped breathing. It was a room not built by settlers, not built by trappers or explorers. It was machine-cut, octagonal, black stone reinforced with riveted plates. The floor had a channel in its center, and the walls bore strange metallic instruments. Long dead now, wires slack, tubes cracked. In the center stood a pedestal. On it, a brass box the size of a saddlebag, and around it a circle of symbols burned faint red. Eli stepped forward. His face wasn't afraid anymore. It was remembering. "Before they died," he whispered, "they brought me here. They made me touch it. It lit up then. They said I had to remember the path." Esther's voice was hollow. "Why you?" Because I was born here, because they made me with it. He looked back. My mother died the day I was born, but my father said she wasn't a local woman, said she came from Far East, said she had gold in her hair and eyes that didn't blink right in the sun. Esther blinked. You think she was one of them? He didn't answer. He just stepped toward the pedestal. He placed his hand on the box, and the symbols glowed bright, red shifting to white, then gold. A low hum filled the chamber. Something woke. Esther drew her rifle and turned. Voices from the tunnel. They were here. The men who came down that tunnel weren't settlers. They weren't even just mercenaries. They moved with precision. Two abreast, formation tight, weapons drawn, dark coats, brass emblems at the shoulder, compass and sunburst everywhere, but Esther had the high ground and a shotgun laced with bear shot. The first blast dropped the lead man. The second tore the wall just above the others, scattering them into cover. Hold fire! One of them shouted. Esther didn't. She fired again. Take her alive if you can, someone barked. Another round cracked past her ear. They weren't trying to kill her. They needed her, or him, which meant she had leverage. She turned toward Eli. Can you shut it down? He didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the box. I think I can finish it. Do it, fast. He nodded, but before she could cover him again, a shot rang out, not from below, from above. The ceiling groaned. A second blast, then fire, a Molotov. They were trying to burn them out, but they'd forgotten where they were. They'd forgotten this wasn't a shack in the woods. This was a vault under a mountain, and the air was sealed. Smoke filled the chamber. Eli dropped to one knee, coughing hard, but his hand never left the box. The glow pulsed faster now. Lines traced across the floor. Not cracks, but veins of light converging beneath the pedestal. Something beneath them was coming online. Esther! He gasped. She dove beside him, pulled her scarf over his mouth. We are out of time, she hissed. I can lock it. How? If I stay? She froze. No, he looked at her. They want me because of what's in me. But if I finish this, I can bury it. Lock it from the inside. No. Isaac knew. That's why he gave you the ledger. Not to run, to choose. She stared at him, and she saw Isaac's face there. Not just the boy's, but the man he might have been. And she made her choice. Outside, the fire spread fast. The men couldn't press forward. The blast from the shotgun had collapsed the upper tunnel. They fell back, coughing, choking, and from deep inside came a rumble. The ground shook, snow fell in sheets from the ridgeline above, and then silence. The tunnel mouth collapsed, stone, ice, final, buried, forever. Esther emerged 12 hours later from the North Trail, face blistered from smoke, hands raw. The satchel was gone, the ledger too. She didn't need them anymore. She had something better. She had a name and a promise. She reached the cabin at dawn. Everything was still. Inside, she found what she left. The boy's coat folded on the cot, her own map inked with new marks, and the compass and sunburst coin broken in half. She sat by the fire, lit a new one, and watched the sky change. Weeks passed. No riders came, no scouts, no word from Ridge Run. She hiked down once, far as the pass, and saw the cabins still buried, but heard voices digging. Survivors, good ones. She didn't stop. She had no more to say. The boy was gone, but the peak held firm, and the storm had passed. They called her mad once, called her foolish, called her cursed, but in the end, hers was the only cabin left standing, and every man in the valley would one day tell their sons, when the world starts to shift, you don't build at the bottom. You build where the wind screams, where the earth is strong. You build like the widow on the mountain peak.